Hi, Lou here with an observation about how game design goes when you keep at it for many years. I think designers go through phases. Now, I'm not counting people who do one game at a time, which I regard as amateurish. It's amateurish because you've certainly got time to do more than one game at a time. And also, if you're only doing one at a time and it's a dog, if it's not very good, you're very reluctant to abandon it because you don't have anything else you're working on. If you have a lot of games you're working on, then you're less likely to abandon something that shouldn't be pursued any further. So I'm talking about people who design a large number of games, like myself. I think normally you go through phases. Um, I like to design multiplayer competitive games, for example. But lately I found myself designing two-player games, as much or more than the multiplayers. Um, there was a time some years ago when I designed lots of card games, which of course are multiplayer generally, but also are quite different because they're card games rather than board games. Now, there is a difference in balancing a multiplayer game and two-player games when they're interactive games. In other words, when the players can affect each other quite strongly. If your game is symmetric, that is to say, everybody starts the same, then balance is not usually a problem. If it's asymmetric, as in a historical game, then you've got a big task. And I'm happy because what I call the invisible hand in a multiplayer game helps to balance it. That is, if players know that one side tends to be weaker or stronger than the other, the way they play will compensate for that. And if they're all doing that, it will take care of it. So if there are four players and one is much stronger than the other, and I'm not talking about the players, but the positions, then the other three positions can counteract that extra strong one. But that's only in games that are highly interactive. If there's low interaction or no interaction, they don't have a chance to do that. This is why Euro-style games are so very often symmetric. Partly it's because people want to make more or less abstract games that way when they make Euro games, but it's partly because then you don't have to worry too much about balance. What you have to worry about mainly is whether the first mover has an advantage or the last mover has an advantage, something like that. And that's relatively simple. Now, what about one-player games? Well, when it's a one-player game or when it's a co-op game, then one side is not run by a human, and it's only run by a deck of cards usually, in the case of a tabletop game. And that means it's not very inventive. It's not very unpredictable. And it makes it much easier, I think, to balance the game one way or the other. So the one players are easier than the two players. The two players are the toughest because there's no invisible hand and because both of the players are human opponents. Now, I've got away from talking about the tendency to design one kind of game or another. I think that partly comes from what interests you and partly comes from what games seem to be popular at the time or what comes to your attention. Like I spend a lot of time on co-op games now, which I never used to do. To me, Dungeons and Dragons is the ultimate co-op game because you have a human-controlled opposition. But you can do it in board games. The trick is to make the opposition interesting and to have enough variety that it's not just a puzzle. So I have my reasons for switching from one to another. And who knows what the next thing is that will attract me. I even started a deck building game the other day, although whether I'll get to the point of actually playing it is another question. I really think there are phases, and you think of games in terms of multiplayer or two-player or one player or whatever. And yet, if you're doing well as a designer, you're still going to design other kinds of games, just not as many at that time. Thanks for listening.